Have you ever thought about how many people on the territory of Ukraine do not believe in this war and do not want to be in the Russian army? In fact, when we consider the war policies implemented by Russian leader Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, it's not difficult to estimate that the number of people who do not want to take part in this war has reached very serious levels. The most important factor in the failure of anti-war Russian soldiers and Russian citizens forcibly sent to the Ukrainian front lines to obey Putin's orders is Russia's inability to provide humanitarian conditions for its soldiers and citizens who join the volunteer army. For this reason, the Russians on the Ukrainian front lines do not want to face the restrictive problems such as infectious diseases, hunger and thirst in Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, have a very striking project that will go down in world history. The name of this project is I Want to Live. This incredible project, which offers a new hope of life for Russians, has become very popular among Russian soldiers and citizens, especially in recent days. Ukrainian officials reported that a website called I Want to Live, created for Russian soldiers who wanted to surrender, had attracted a total of more than 15 million visitors in the last 7 months. The I Want to Live hotline receives an average of 80 calls a day from people who don't want to die for the Russian regime in Russia or the occupied territory of Ukraine and want to surrender. In addition, according to the latest reports of Ukrainian officials involved in this surrender line project, approximately 3,200 Russian soldiers have surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces since last month. Vitaly Matvienko, head of the Ukraine hotline, announced recently that more than 16,000 Russian applicants have surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces through the project since the start of September. On the other hand, the Ukrainian official added that the number of Russian applications increased by 10% from March to April. These numbers are described as high enough to thwart leader Vladimir Putin's plans to invade Ukraine. Also in a tweet recently, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry used the surrender project as a mockery against the Kremlin. In this tweet, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry emphasized that the closer the counterattack, the hotter the surrender season. The continuation of the tweet was as follows: "Don't wait for the heat. There are currently the most favorable conditions for surrender." These striking statements had the effect of an earthquake in Moscow. In addition, such approach just destroyed the trust of Russian citizens in the Moscow administration. Therefore, the number of Russian citizens who wanted to surrender was normally increasing day by day. Vitaly Matvienko, spokesperson for the I Want to Live hotline, stated that in the last 6 months they received a total of 12,000 questions from the Russians about surrender. In addition, Matvienko added that the calls to ask questions about surrender came mainly from Moscow and Leningrad regions, as well as Chelyabinsk, Novgorod, and occupied Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. Matvienko noted that the I Want to Live team sometimes found themselves on the phone saying words of consolation to Russians who burst into tears. In fact, we know very well that after 20 years of propaganda in Russia, the people there have been completely brainwashed. But there is still a group of intelligent people who can think critically. Russian citizens fleeing from Russia's occupation policies by calling the surrender line called I Want to Live are the most concrete examples of this situation. Meanwhile, Ukraine developed new strategies and demonstrated remarkable ingenuity to persuade Russian soldiers to surrender. Konstantin Melnikov, a war correspondent who is often on the front lines, explained that the Ukrainian military designs its own unique advertising campaigns. In this campaign, Melnikov noted Ukrainian troops printed special leaflets, loading them into shells and fired them into the Russian-occupied territory with a Grad rocket launcher. The leaflets state in Russian that the Russians should surrender voluntarily, and they give accurate statistics of the Ukrainian General Staff on Russian casualties. In addition, the brochures prepared within the scope of the campaign include the phone numbers that those who want to surrender can call. The most striking detail in the brochures was a price list showing how much money Russian soldiers can earn if they surrendered with their equipment. According to the price list prepared by the Ukrainians, Russian soldiers who deliver a tank can receive a total payment of $10,000. Also, alongside these campaigns in the expansion of the I Want to Live project, in December, a training video was released explaining to prospective Russian POWs how to surrender not only directly to the Ukrainian authorities, but also to a drone. Analysts predict that more and more Russians will surrender, noting that Ukraine, unlike Russia, complies with the Geneva Conventions as well as such campaigns and practices when it comes to respecting the rights of prisoners of war. Ukrainian Ombudsman Dmytro Lubnitz confirmed that a monitoring mission carried out on March 28 is one of the camps where Russian prisoners are held has met international standards for the treatment of prisoners. Lubnitz and his team carried out this critical task. Lubnitz found on his Telegram channel that Russian prisoners of war are being held in accordance with the requirements of the Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War. According to the observations of Lubnitz and his team, the temperature conditions and daily routine at the facilities met all the requirements of the contract. In addition, surrendering Russian soldiers have the right to communicate and work with their relatives in turn through periodic telephone calls. According to the requirements of the Geneva Convention, the surrendered here are fed a military menu. In addition, human rights and social activist Tati and Ivanova emphasized that when the Russians were taken prisoner in the caravanserai, they saw that the conditions of captivity were not humiliating. Considering all of this, Ukraine was proving to the whole world how conscientious and humane it approached the prisoners of war. The surrendered Russians are, of course, in detention. Of course they are in detention centers. But according to the agreement implemented by the Ukrainians, these people are kept separate from the criminals. They were not kept in the same cells as the criminals. These people say that they are ready to work on the construction sites here and repair what they have destroyed. In short, Russian soldiers and citizens who surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces never want to return to Russia. They don't want to go back because they know what awaits them at home. So how did I Want to Live, presented by Ukraine, which is a completely new hope of life for Russians, begin? The project was created to provide Russian and Belarusian military personnel to escape the war in Ukraine. I Want to Live spokesman Vitaly Matvienko stated that they officially launched the surrender line on September 18, 2022, a few days before Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the start of the mobilization. The hotline, which was initially supervised by the National Police of Ukraine, was later transferred to Kazubov. The surrender line I Want to Live, which has become almost corporate, is now operated around the clock by operators who answer calls and process messages from various messaging applications. Matvienko noted that in addition to investigations from active soldiers, the initiative has received numerous calls from Russian civilians who fear that they will be enlisted soon. The increase in surrender numbers was mainly due to fears of a counterattack expected this spring from Ukraine. In fact, the vast majority of Russians do not want to fight. They want to save their own lives by surrendering. This is a good alternative because the days ahead are not looking good for Russia. The approach of the Moscow administration towards its capitulating citizens is much more hopeless than the possible future situation of Russia. In a preemptive move to intimidate asylum seekers, Russia's Supreme Court ruled last week that Russian soldiers could be sentenced to up to 10 years in prison for voluntarily surrendering. Here is a short and clear summary of the value Russia attaches to its citizens and soldiers. This is the most visible proof that free will no longer exist in Russia. But freedom is such an important phenomenon that the Russians, who want to live free despite the threats of the Putin regime and surrender to Kiev, respect the freedom of the Ukrainians in the same way. Ukrainian forces continued to attack from several different directions in the third week of the counteroffensive. the Russian military is starting to feel the impact of the counterattack and is repositioning units in other sectors of the battlefield to fill the gaps. The Russian army began to move its forces from the eastern bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson to strengthen the defensive lines in Zaporizhia and Donbass. In the past few days, the Russian army has relocated several thousand soldiers, including elite VDV paratroopers and Marines. This redeployment likely reflects Russia's perception that a major Ukrainian offensive along the Dnipro is now less likely after the collapse of the Kakhovka Dam and the consequent flooding. But this may be exactly what the Ukrainian leadership wants to do, pretending to attack in one place to draw Russian reserves from their true target. However, the current Dnipro River crossing will be one of the largest amphibious operations in recent times. Meanwhile, the Russian forces on land continue to suffer significant losses. The Russian casualty rate stabilized in the third week of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. In the last few days, the Russian army has lost an average of 650 soldiers per day. The failures and losses in the front lines of the Russian army have turned the balance upside down. While Russian casualties increase, striking news continues to come from the front. Undoubtedly, the most striking news is the Russian soldiers fleeing from the front line. According to the Ukrainian military, Russian fighters are fleeing the front line in eastern Ukraine as Kiev's counteroffensive gains momentum. The operational update from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that Moscow troops moved away from the front lines in the disputed eastern Luhansk region. The Ukrainian General Staff said that a group of Russian soldiers fleeing their positions, defined as mobilized forces, were found in the Ukrainian village of Novorossiya. It was stated that the search operations for the fleeing soldiers were also carried out by the Russian National Guard. Desertion has become a documented problem for Russian forces in Ukraine. In November 2022, the UK Ministry of Defense stated that Kremlin generals may have authorized the use of weapons against deserters, including allowing fire to cover such flaws after a warning has been issued. In fact, the tactic of shooting deserters attests to the low quality, low morale, and indiscipline of the Russian forces. Earlier this month, footage circulating in the Ukrainian media showed Moscow troops firing at their retreating soldiers. In the last days of May, several dozen armed conflicts fleeing the Luhansk region caused turmoil in Rostov. 39 armed soldiers from the Storm Z detachment fled Lysychansk, Ukraine's occupied Luhansk region. The deserted soldiers were all ex-convicts who went to fight under contract during the escape. A soldier from the self-proclaimed DLPR Ministry of State Security was killed while trying to stop the deserters. But the most striking thing here was that some of the deserting Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces. As it is known, conflicts in the eastern and southern axis of Ukraine have flared up considerably. They have begun to feel the heat of war in cities deep in Russia, as well as in Russian cities close to the Ukrainian border. All these developments have pushed the Russian soldiers to the fine line between death and life. While fierce clashes continue on the front lines, the avalanche of Russian casualties has brought the soldiers to a turning point. Having no faith in Vladimir Putin's war, the Russians have begun to look for ways to save themselves. The paths of Russian soldiers have crossed with Ukraine's compassionate project. At this point, the I Want to Live project launched in September has saved the lives of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers. Ukraine's I Want to Live hotline for Russian soldiers who want to surrender received 3,174 calls in April, an increase of 10% compared to the previous month. In May, this rate increased even more. The rate of surrender of Russian troops peaked when Ukraine's large-scale counteroffensive began in June. The Russians, suffering from mental collapse, even offered to deliver equipment and heavy armored vehicles by calling the hotline. On the other hand, since the start of the summer offensive, the Ukrainian army has been capturing 5 to 10 Russian service personnel per day in the Donbass and Zaporizhia regions. The fact that a total of 70 or more Russian POWs were rounded up in a single 7-day period matches the capture rates set in the early days of the war, when signs of weakening Russian morale were significant. On the other hand, it was not only the Ukrainian armed forces that captured Russian soldiers. Anti-Kremlin rebels claimed to have captured large numbers of Russian soldiers in the city of Belgorod, near the Ukrainian border. Paramilitary forces opposing Vladimir Putin's regime had invited the city's governor to meet with them in order to deliver the detainees and hold talks. However, the Russian Volunteer Corps and Russia's Freedom Legion jointly announced that Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov could not find the courage to meet with them, and they would hand over their captives to Ukraine. It seems that counter-offensive operations hold no promise for the Russian army. Shaken by casualties and losing their faith in war, the Russians find a solution by fleeing from the front lines or surrendering. A more piteous end awaits the Russian soldiers who could not carry out these actions voluntarily. These soldiers either lose their lives on the front lines or are captured as prisoners. So what has been happening on the front lines lately while the state of the Russian army is so deplorable? According to a new assessment, Ukrainian troops have pushed Kiev's counterattack into at least 4 sectors of the front line with Russia. According to an analysis by the Institute for the Study of War think tank, counter-offensive operations are largely concentrated in the eastern Next region and parts of the southern Zaporizhia region. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Heinmeyer said in a statement on social media that Ukrainian forces recaptured the village of Piatkovsky on the southern front. In total, 8 settlements have been liberated this month, and 113 square kilometers of territory have been recaptured. Mailer said this since the start of the counterattack. Russian military officials later denied that Patsatsia was under Ukrainian control, but Russian mill bloggers such as Wargonzo noted that Russian forces had withdrawn. Ukraine allegedly advanced up to a kilometer near Avdiivka in Donetsk. EZU noted that Ukrainian forces continue offensive operations in the south, southwest, and southeast of Volchanovo-Silka, close to the administrative border between the two regions. In addition, the armed forces of Ukraine struck a Russian ammunition depot in the temporarily occupied part of the Kherson region. The warehouse was hit in the village of Rakov, about 116 kilometers from the front line. It is possible to damage the depot at this distance using the Franco-British Storm Shadow cruise missile or most likely the Tochkuchi BM. Eyewitnesses said that the ammunition explosion in the warehouse lasted for several hours. The Osint community reported that the repository was located on the territory of the local silo. In another development, Ukrainian forces destroyed a huge ammunition depot south of Melitopol. News sources on both sides believe it was also the result of the Storm Shadow missile attack. The location was pretty obvious as the Russians were seen building and filling warehouses at one of the official train stops on the Melitopol road. Satellite images show that the explosion completely destroyed all buildings in the area and damaged those near the warehouses. The successes at the front, in general, and the destruction of the commanders responsible for the stability of this region, the reserve forces, and warehouses create favorable conditions for further progress. As a result, Ukraine's counterattack continues to move forward with determined steps. The advance of the Kiev troops sows the seeds of fear in the hearts of Russian soldiers. The Russian army is awash with desertions and surrenders. The unexpectedly rapid and peaceful reconciliation of the conflict between the Russian Ministry of Defense and the private military company, the Wagner Group, especially as there is no confirmation that Prigozhin's demands were met, left many people very suspicious. Some analysts started building theories as to how such a large-scale act could be used to achieve strategic objectives and concluded that this would be a great opportunity to redeploy forces to the Kharkiv region and take the city into a pocket as the returning from Moscow. Wagner forces were very close to the Belgorod region. It is reasonable to some extent to consider such a possibility because both sides are monitoring each other's movement of troops very tightly. and the only way to show up somewhere unexpectedly is by tricking the other party into thinking that they don't need to care about it. However, firstly, it's not like all of the Wagner forces were heading north. Most of the troops were occupying Rostov and the military objects nearby, so the Wagner forces got dispersed. Secondly, there is not much of Wagner's left anyways. According to Prigozhin, he had 85,000 troops to take Bakhmut, and it took him more than 8 months and mind-boggling losses to take it. The hockey front is 10 times bigger. Kharkiv itself is 10 times bigger, and the Ukrainians have tens of thousands of soldiers in the region. So even if all Wagner units suddenly redeployed here, the prospect of a quick victory would be virtually non-existent. Besides, Russian forces had already tried to take Kharkiv with more troops and under much better conditions, and it ended up in a disaster. Lastly, Wagner forces were initially in Luhansk, so making a several-day detour towards Moscow is less productive. And this is where other analysts concluded that in reality, Wagner forces are redeploying to Belarus to attack Kiev or Lviv. On the surface, it also ties in nicely with the fact that the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, got involved and eventually offered shelter to Prigozhin. However, all previous points remain relevant. Counter-arguments here as well. Dispersing troops by occupying Rostov would be counterproductive. The front line is 30 times bigger. Ukrainians have tens of thousands of soldiers on guard. Russians already tried anyways, and here there are also dense forests which prove to be an extremely hard barrier. On top of that, during the mutiny, Russian forces lost 7 aircraft and 15 pilots. Half of them are extraordinarily valuable, and this is not taken into account. The blown-up Wagner convoys and violent engagements with the regular Russian forces that were caught on camera and shown in my previous video. Nonetheless, one thing the Wagner mutiny actually achieved was completely cutting off supplies of the Eastern Russian group of forces for at least 2 days and confusing the soldiers on the ground, of which Ukrainians successfully took advantage. Ukrainian fighters from the Bakhmut region reported that when Prigozhin posted a video and said that the regular Russian forces bombed Wagner camps and the Wagner forces were marching on Moscow, the Russian radio exchanges became completely wild, and eventually it caused a series of violent confrontations between the regular Russian formations and a few Wagner units that were still in Bakhmut to help. First of all, Ukrainian fighters from the 24th Assault Brigade reported that Ukrainians finally breached the Russian defense in the tree line along the road and started storming the last Romanian fortification on their way to Klisivac, namely the infamous trench network on the hill. Secondly, after clearing the tree line, Ukrainians could attack Russian positions in the forest from 2 sides. And by the end of the second day, the Ukrainian 5th Assault Brigade reportedly cleared up to 40% of the forest. Lastly, Ukrainians finally pushed the Russians from the remaining positions west of the canal, and some sources even claimed that Ukrainians made a few attempts to establish control over Kazhumyaka and Osenovka. Russian forces reportedly retreated to the western part of the village to create a buffer zone, which at the moment remains a gray zone. However, the biggest news by far is that Ukrainians crossed the Dnipro River and established a bridgehead on the eastern bank near the Antonivsky Bridge. Geolocated footage confirms that Ukrainian boats have deployed Ukrainian forces to this region. Russian forces tried to chase Ukrainians away with direct assault. However, they faced tough resistance. Ukrainians posted footage of Ukrainian helicopters targeting Russian assault units. Eventually, Russian sources reported that the units on the ground got almost encircled, which is why they decided to retreat. Ukrainian president stated that the Wagner mutiny created unique opportunities for the Ukrainians that may lead to the biggest turning points in the history of this war. In order to identify which events have the potential to cause such monumental changes, the first thing I do is to look up the events that catch the attention of at least a dozen of reputable sources.